to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. My guest today is journalist Alison Weir. Her best-selling book, Against Our Better Judgment, The Hidden History of How the U.S. Was Used to Create Israel, has been called a must-read for all Americans. And her websites, ifamericans.knew.org and israelpalestinenews.org, are invaluable sources for information on Palestinian human rights and the pernicious influence of the Zionist lobby on U.S. politics. I begin the interview by asking Alison Weir how she came to discard the image of the State of Israel most of us grew up with and become an advocate for the Palestinian people.
It was really very random in a number of ways, because like you and like most Americans, I definitely was very sympathetic to Israel. That's what I saw, Exodus, and we're very aware of the Nazi Holocaust and oppression. And so sort of our default is to be sympathetic to Israel. And so I was. But then I've been politically active on other issues at previous times in my life against the Vietnam War and in favor of civil rights, that type of thing. But I had never worked on Israel-Palestine or really been aware of it at all. But then in fall of 2000, the second intifada began. That's just an intifada, as you know, just means uprising.
Right.
And I was the editor of a small newspaper, just a weekly newspaper. So this was outside my work. But I just got curious about that issue since it was sort of in the news. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I think I'll pay attention and learn what this is about. And when I finally paid attention to it, as a journalist, I noticed very quickly how one-sided the coverage was. I mostly listened to NPR and, looked at the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle. And I noticed that the coverage was really focused, it was really very Israeli-centric, that we would hear about Israel all the time from Israelis, and definitely we're getting that viewpoint, which was valuable. I wanted that information. But since there are two populations involved, I wanted the whole story. And it seemed to me that they weren't giving it to us. Mm-hmm. So I began looking on the internet. And remember, back in fall of 2000, it was really very new to research on the internet. Most of us had emails by then. But anyway, I started to do that. And I came across excellent news sources from the region itself, humanitarian agencies that were there, both Israeli and Palestinian media. So I began to learn every night when I'd get home from work and look into this, I would find these very strong news reports about Israeli forces shooting largely unarmed demonstrators, Palestinian demonstrators, every day, large numbers, many of them children, many being shot in the head. Mm-hmm. So the more I followed that from the regional news, and the more I saw what was in the U.S. media and listened to NPR, I noticed there was a huge disconnect. Mm-hmm. So after a few months, I got drawn into the story so much. It seemed like a major cover-up that dwarfed other enormous cover-ups that I've seen, that we've all seen. So after a few months, I quit my job in Sausalito, and I traveled over to the West Bank and Gaza as a freelance reporter in early 2001. Many months before 9/11. Right. So that's how I got started.
You've chosen, I think, interestingly enough, to, in some way concentrate some of your work and your book, Against Our Better Judgment, on exposing the Israel lobby in the United States, which I know is responsible for the one-sided news coverage that you were encountering and still will encounter, in our media today. You've said that the U.S. connection to Israel is one of the most critical issues in the world today, and that the lack of engagement by activists has allowed fanatics to drive U.S. policy. Can you maybe elaborate on that a bit?
I'd be glad to. And as you say, a lot of my current writing and my book does focus on the Israel lobby. Mm-hmm. At the beginning, my journalism on this did not do that. At the beginning, I was writing news stories about the latest violence and human rights abuses in the Palestinian territories, both Gaza and the West Bank. But after a while, you get tired of writing those. We could write one of those every single day.
Yes.
Instead, I started looking at, well, what is driving U.S. policies? Why are we giving Israel this massive amount, over $10 million per day of our tax money, when it has really no natural resources of significance? The oil is not in Israel. By that time, I'd read a number of books on this and was realizing that the U.S. establishment originally did not support Zionism, including the intelligence agencies, the diplomats, the State Department, the Pentagon. None of them were supporting Zionism. So why was the U.S. pursuing a policy that was enabling this massive violence and tragedy in Palestine and elsewhere? So I looked into the Israel lobby more and more and discovered this huge amount of information that was even more covered up than the information about Palestine itself. So people often talk about the Israel-Palestine issue as the third rail. You better not touch it. A politician, a journalist, almost anyone. You better not touch it. But within the third rail, the really most dangerous part is telling the facts about the Israel lobby. So I determined to do that. And I think it's hugely important because you have to diagnose the cause of the illness. We misanalyze why the U.S. is supporting Israel. We realize that the U.S. policies are horrible. They are enabling policies that they're enabling actions that most Americans across the political spectrum of all races and ethnicities would not support. So if people don't know that this is wrong with our government and what's driving it, we won't address it. So for all of these decades, when a number of other issues have improved, some maybe have gotten worse, but there have been improvements because people became aware of the problem and worked on it. But on all this time that we worked on other problems of racism, violence, and wars, this issue was being ignored and covered up.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, it does, and it really is very pervasive. I know, we have a lot of egregious examples of how pervasive the Israel lobby has been in Washington. But I think one of the things that people may be less aware of is how it operates even at a local level in terms of the progressive movement. Well, one of the things we see here a lot is the effort to move everything in Israel-Palestine toward dialogue, as opposed to confronting the war crimes and the crimes against humanity there.
Throughout the last 18 years, I've seen a lot of strategies to sort of derail activism, to bring justice in Palestine and to end the violence. Many different types of strategies. They keep morphing as they need to develop new strategies. So for a long time, the idea would be to just have dialogue and just talk here in the United States and make friends. Well, it's wonderful to make friends. It's wonderful to get to know one another. But that's like seeing a child being beaten up by a football player and saying, well, those of us on the sidelines will just talk to each other. We won't intercede and stop the violence and then talk. So in this case, I feel the first thing that needed to be done is awakening the American population and stopping the injustice, stopping the violence, stopping the policies that are extremely damaging and enabling these criminal violent actions. Not just talking to one another back here. I would see on campuses that I remember going to one campus in the Midwest, and there was I think it was either an Arab or a Muslim group of students, and the local Hillel on the campus had wanted to have, meet one another and talk, which was, of course, good. But students have limited time. So if you're talking, then you're not putting on events, you're not alerting the campus to important facts. Plus, what was done then is that then when the student group that was supportive of all human rights, including Palestinian human rights, were going to bring me to speak, Hillel said, "Oh, how can you do this? We're such good friends. How can you bring in somebody to talk about Palestine?" So they were trying to use that dialogue group. Clearly, it was meant to derail any work to bring justice in Palestine. Right. So then the next step seemed to be to infiltrate groups that were working on Palestine. Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, for example, people that, for example, at UC Berkeley, that 17 years ago had a very active SJP chapter doing really cutting-edge types of activism on the Berkeley campus. Fairly soon, within a few years, there was an Israeli member who proclaimed that he was pro-Palestine. He suggested he was anti-Zionist. And then he started censoring what they would do and giving them false information. And the students, as people are in general, thought, "Oh, this is our friend and ally." Mm-hmm. They trusted him, didn't investigate the information he was giving them to learn that it was false, and derailed their activism. That type of thing goes on all over the country.
No, it really is and I know one of the most, I think, insidious efforts recently, and I think you've exposed this on your website, if Americans knew, right, is the Canary Mission, which is really a basically Israeli government-sponsored effort to quash any kind of student activism, for Palestine.
Well, yes, this is a website that, fortunately, some of the information got leaked, and now we have more information about who's behind it. Is something, I think it was, unfortunately, this was a few months ago, so I'm just trying to remember some of the details. But I think, as I recall, there were some major nonprofit organizations that turns out were secretly funding, giving money to this Canary Mission, which basically stalks students and others that are working on behalf of Palestinian rights and tries to do damage to them, tries to prevent activism on the Palestinian issue. And those were extremely important exposés about the Canary Mission. And I think one of the people, for example, that was helping fund it was on one of the boards of UC Berkeley, University of California.
Yeah.
And somebody that was secretly funding really highly unethical activities.
Yeah, I mean, it even extended to trying to prevent students who are pro-Palestinian activists from getting jobs after they graduated. But one of the most powerful things, and I was reading former Congressman Paul Findley's book, They Dare to Speak Out, and he quoted former State Department official George Ball as saying that, and I've got the quote, he says, "The lobby so often equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. They keep pounding away at that theme and people are deterred from speaking out." Maybe you can provide some examples of that technique or how it's being used these days.
First, though, just let me mention that it's not just the Canary Mission that's been doing those types of activities. That was being done somewhat, as I said, the funders and people behind it were kept secret, which shows they knew it was wrong.
Right.
But what's interesting is that some that's been done publicly, but most people are just not aware of it, and the media doesn't expose it to the general public. So, for example, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which is constantly cited in the media as though it is God. You would think this was a major governmental commission with some sort of accountability. No, it's a private organization. One of its two missions is to advocate for Islam. It's, on its own website. It had a campus guide a few years ago. We published it on the If Americans Knew website that gave advice about how to prevent events on campus that would tell about Palestinians. Actually, how to do that. This is the ADL, which many people think opposes defamation, but in reality defames people.
Depends on who's being defamed.
Pretty much every day, certainly every few days, there is some news report quoting the ADL. There is supposedly a rise in anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. Newspapers all over the country report that week after week after week. Nobody examines it. Nobody questions it. It's just, quote, a given. Well, the ADL, if you look on their website, again, this isn't hidden, but most people don't have the time or the resources to look deeper. Right there, they equate criticism of Israel. Certain types, they would say, oh, not all. Certain types are permitted. But many factual statements about Israel are defined by the ADL as anti-Semitism. So, you and I are speaking right now. I don't think we've said the word Jewish at any point. And yet this would be called by the ADL as an anti-Semitic discussion. So the ADL is claiming that there is a rise in anti-Semitism. I question, first of all, how much is that? What is the dictionary definition of anti-Semitism, which is bigotry or prejudice or actions against Jewish people? I question how much of the, quote, rise in anti-Semitism actually is anti-Semitism.
Right.
Nobody wants bigotry. I don't want prejudice or bias or bigotry or violence against any population group, including Jewish Americans. So let's look at this. If there's a rise in it, if that's the case, let's look at what these incidents are and how to prevent them. So I contacted the ADL to find out information. They just issued a report about the rise in anti-Semitism. So I called them to ask them, what it consisted of, and asked if they could send me the information to examine. Well, the person on the phone from the ADL said that, well, this is not a scientific study. This is more getting a feel for where people are. And yet presented as a scientific study, there's a given. But here was one of their officials on the phone telling me that's not what it was. I think that's important to know, because you will see every week, you'll see more reports about a supposed rise in anti-Semitism, according to the ADL. A former Israeli official, a Knesset member, went on Democracy Now! Several years ago with Amy Goodman. And Amy Goodman asked her about this problem of Israel partisans claiming that someone was anti-Semitic because of statements they had made about Israeli oppression of Palestinians. On Democracy Now!, she told Amy Goodman, this is a trick. We use it all the time. She said, when in Europe somebody is critical of Israel, we bring up the Holocaust. In the United States, when someone is critical of Israel, we call them anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what they do. She said, it's a trick we use all the time. And we have that video on our website, on our YouTube channel. Many people I have seen it by now. It's many places. But also, even before she said that, there was a speech several years ago by Victor Ostrovsky, a former Mossad member who has written two very, very informative books about the Mossad. And in his speech, he said one of the things that we did in the Mossad would be to plant that somebody was anti-Semitic. That's what we did. We would plant around the country that someone was, quote, anti-Semitic. And he said that specifically in those particular cases that was being planted by the Mossad.
You're listening to Wider View, a weekly conversation with analysts and activists rarely found in the mainstream media. Wider View is made available free of charge to radio stations nationwide, and a podcast of this show is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play Music as Wider View Radio, and at widerviewradio.podbean.com. You can also follow us on Facebook at Wider View Radio. One of the most egregious examples of Israeli dominance over the U.S. political system, right, is right now going on. I mean, as we speak, right now the Senate is once again debating the very first bill they decided to take up in the new session of Congress, which is called the Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act. I'm sure you're very aware of what this act is. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the provisions of that, particularly the additional money and the parts against BDS.
Yes, that's a truly Orwellian titled.
Right.
Yes, this is a composite bill of four provisions, four components, all on behalf of Israel. It's very revealing that the Senate's first bill of 2019 is for Israel.
Right.
It was introduced by Marco Rubio, who has been funded largely by Israel partisans like Sheldon Adelson, Norman Brayman, Larry Ellison.
Right.
We have an article about that too. So here's this bill, the first bill of 2019 for Israel. The first component of that bill is to give Israel $38 billion over the next 10 years. This is a package. This is the largest military aid package in U.S. history. They were unable to pass that in 2018 because it was held up, interestingly, by Rand Paul, who often is against foreign aid and has different positions on things. But anyway, they couldn't pass that. It was supported. It was bipartisan. There was bipartisan support. There were hundreds of the House version had hundreds of co-sponsors from both parties. None of that. That was all being covered in the Israeli media. Israeli media were covering our tax money to Israel. The U.S. media never even mentioned it.
Nope.
Because I was tracking this the whole time. So, New York Times, Fox News, NPR, nobody told Americans that the largest military aid package in U.S. history was before Congress. Nobody knew about that. We wrote about it. We sent it out quite a bit. A number of other groups that claimed to be pro-Palestinian didn't mention it either. There are two pieces to it. One piece of it was already passed in the defense spending bill. That was about $5.5 billion. And the remaining $33 billion is what's in this bill in Congress right now.
Right.
By the way, that the package works out to about $23,000 per Jewish Israeli family of four. $23,000. It's $7,000 per minute to Israel. The fourth component of it is, quote, combating BDS, which is BDS, as I'm sure your listeners know, is boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel over Israel's violations of international law and human rights. You know, it's not being boycotted because it's, quote, the Jewish state. It's being boycotted because of violent abuses of human rights, because of a system of government that is based on discrimination. So it's an appropriate, nonviolent way to bring pressure on a state that's committed human rights violations. And this bill, one of the components is to enable laws in the states and local governments to ban boycotts in a way. It's sort of complicated, but it's basically it's to hurt the BDS movement, to make it more and more difficult, eventually impossible, for anyone to boycott Israel. Then there are two other components that have to do with Israel's larger plan, strategic plan that has been around for many decades, to fragment the Middle East and to damage countries that might support Palestinian rights. So those are focused on giving more money to Jordan, which the pro-Israel groups that are writing about this point out this is a good ally to Israel. This helps Israel. We bought them off with U.S. tax money from supporting Palestine. So this is, also on behalf of Israel. And the fourth part is an anti-Assad portion of it. And again, Syria has been in the sights of Israel for many decades. Countries that need to be, quote, neutralized, which means damaged and its political power diminished.
Our Middle East policy, our Iraq policy, our Iran policy, our Syria policy is for Israel. There are really no significant U.S. interests at stake there that would cause us to go to the drastic lengths we've gone to in those countries. I mean, it's all about Israel. We are about out of time, so I want to, if you could just tell us tell people where they can find more information, what your websites are, and so forth, so that, people who are intrigued by this can know where to go.
IfAmericansKnew.org is our main website. If Americans Knew. We have a blog that we post to daily that's much more dynamic, and that's the URL is IsraelPalestineNews.org. But you can also get to it from our main website.
Right.
We also have several other websites that you can get to from those websites. We have a timeline that tells all the Palestinians and Israelis killed in recent years, with specific information on every one of those deaths that I think is very, very revealing and illuminating for people to see. So we also have a YouTube channel, If Americans Knew YouTube, that has a lot of very strong videos on it, including the Al Jazeera video documentary on the Israel lobby that was censored, but has been leaked, and that's also on our YouTube channel.
Excellent. Good. Now, great. That's good news, and I do recommend that people go to those sites and get all that information. That's very good. Well, thank you very much, Alison, for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again to Alison Weir for that interview. I do apologize for the poor sound quality of the recording. It was just something we could not fix at the time, and I was unable to fix afterward. The Senate bill we discussed, S1, is still in process, primarily due to the fact that the Democrats are refusing to pass any bill until the government is reopened. But there can be little doubt that once the shutdown is ended, this bill, or one very much like it, will pass with near unanimous bipartisan support. The House, now under Democratic control, voted 411-1 on Friday for a bill that would force President Trump to nominate an anti-Semitism envoy. Alison Weir's website, IsraelPalestineNews.org, reports that the bill uses a definition of anti-Semitism that includes certain criticisms of Israel. The position of anti-Semitism envoy was created in 2004 over the objections of the State Department, which said it wasn't needed. It had been urged by Israeli Minister for Diaspora Affairs Nathan Sharansky, who had formulated a new definition of anti-Semitism that included criticism of Israel. Previous anti-Semitism envoys, before or after serving in the position, worked for the Israeli lobbying organization AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. The Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, one of whose missions is to advocate for Israel, has been heavily promoting the legislation, which was first introduced last year. Well, that's our show for this week. If you have comments or questions about what you've heard, email me at widerviewradio@gmail.com or put a comment on our Facebook page at Widerview Radio. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks again for listening.